We assemble every first day of the week to remember Christ's death and to eat the Lord's Supper. And this morning, in preparation for us to partake, I'm going to recount a lot of what Jesus went through, especially focused on his trial and his crucifixion, as it's described in the gospel accounts. So I've compiled details from all four accounts, not all the details, but many details, and tried to put them in order as well as I could, which was actually a really good and fruitful exercise to be diving into all four and trying to piece it together. I hadn't actually done that before, and I recommend that to you if you've not done it. Lots of time, it caused me to spend lots of time thinking and meditating and sifting through what Jesus went through, what he endured the night that he was arrested and the day that he was crucified, which is a valuable thing. It's very humbling. He endured so much for me and for you. So I invite you this morning to take some time with me this morning to listen to the story and to imagine what it was like to endure all the things that he went through and to appreciate that he willingly endured it for all of us. On the night that Jesus was arrested, we read that his disciples fled, and he was brought to the house of Annas, who was the father of Caiaphas, the high priest, and Annas questioned him in the middle of the night. In John chapter 18, we read about it in verse 19. John writes, the high priest, I believe he's referencing Annas here, then questioned Jesus about his disciples and about his teaching. Jesus answered him, I have spoken openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where all the Jews come together, and I spoke nothing in secret. So why do you question me? Question those who have heard what I spoke to them. They know what I said. When he said this, one of the officers standing nearby struck Jesus, saying, Is that the way you would answer the high priest? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken wrongly, testify of the wrong, but if rightly, why do you strike me? So Annas sent him bound to Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter, now I'm not reading anymore, so if you're following along, just have to listen. Peter followed at a distance and ended up in Caiaphas's courtyard. And as many of us know, Peter was questioned and asked, don't you know Jesus? Aren't you one of his followers? He was asked 3 times if he was with Jesus or knew Jesus or was one of his followers. And Peter denied him all 3 times. And as Jesus said, the rooster crowed. And at that moment, Luke records that the Lord turned and looked at Peter. And Peter wept bitterly. And then Luke records in chapter 22, I'm starting in verse 63, he said, Now the men who were holding Jesus in custody, this is at Caiaphas' house as far as I can tell, they were mocking him and beating him. And they blindfolded him and were asking him, saying, Prophesy, who's the one who hit you? And they were saying many other things against him, blaspheming. This is all happening in the middle of the night. And I would remind you that before then he was in the Garden of Gethsemane preparing for all this and praying and sweating and agonizing. But in the end said, Not my will, but your will be done. And so here he goes, dealing with all of this in the middle of the night, being questioned, being harassed, being mocked. And he was held at Caiaphas' home until the morning. And in verse 66 of Luke 22, we read, When it was day, the council of the elders of the people assembled, both the chief priests and the scribes, and they led him away to their council chamber. And so he's in the chamber where the Sanhedrin meets before all these Jewish leaders. And in verse 67, they say, If you are the Christ, tell us. But he said to them, If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I ask a question, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God. And they asked him, Are you the Son of God then? And he said, Yes, I am. And they said, "What further testimony do we need? For we have heard it ourselves from his own mouth." In Luke 23, verse 1, we read, "Then the whole body of them got up and brought him before Pilate." So they take him to Pilate, and it's most likely still early in the morning after a long night. And they began to accuse him before Pilate, saying, "We found this man misleading our nation and forbidding to pay taxes to Caesar, and saying that he himself is Christ, a king." Pilate entered again into the praetorium and summoned Jesus and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Are you saying this of your own initiative, or did others tell you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priests delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." Therefore Pilate said to him, "So you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say correctly that I am a king. For this I have been born, and for this I have come into the world, to testify the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, "I find no guilt in him." But they kept on insisting, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching all over Judea, starting from Galilee, even as far as this place." Then he sent to Herod, because he lived in Herod's jurisdiction. And Herod also questioned him at some length, and the chief priests and scribes came along, and they were standing there accusing him vehemently. And Herod, with his soldiers, after treating him with contempt and mocking him, dressed him in a gorgeous robe and sent him back to Pilate. So he's back with Pilate again. I'm in Luke. If you're following along, I'm sorry, I skip around a lot. I said it was from all four accounts, but Luke 23, verse 13. Pilate then called the chief priests and the rulers and the people. He brought them all together and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was misleading the people, and after examining him before you, behold, I did not find this man guilty of any of your charges against him. And neither did Herod, for he sent him back to us. Look, nothing deserving of death has been done by him. I will therefore punish and release him." But they cried out all together, "Away with this man, and release to us Barabbas," a man who had been thrown into prison for an insurrection started in the city and for murder. Pilate addressed them once more, desiring to release Jesus, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no guilt deserving death. I will therefore punish and release him." But they were urgent, demanding with loud cries that he should be crucified. And their voices prevailed. So Pilate decided that their demand should be granted. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, for whom they asked, but he delivered Jesus over to their will. Pilate, in John 19, Pilate then took Jesus and scourged him. He whipped him. Painful. And the soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and put a purple robe on him. And they began to come up to him and say, "Hail, King of the Jews," and to give him slaps on his face. Pilate came out and again said to them, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you so that you may know that I find no guilt in him." Jesus then came out, wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Behold the man." So when the chief priests and officers saw him, they cried out, saying, "Crucify! Crucify!" Pilate said to them, "Take him yourselves and crucify him, for I find no guilt in him." The Jews answered him, "We have a law, and by that law he ought to die, because he made himself out to be the Son of God." Therefore, when Pilate heard this statement, he was even more afraid. And he entered into the praetorium again and said to Jesus, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave him no answer. So Pilate said to him, "You do not speak to me? Do you not know that I have the authority to release you, and I have the authority to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no authority over me unless it had been given to you from above. For this reason, he who delivered me to you has the greater sin." As a result of this, Pilate made efforts to release him, but the Jews cried out, saying, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Everyone who makes himself out to be a king opposes Caesar." Therefore, when Pilate heard these words, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judgment seat at a place called the Pavement, but in Hebrew, Gabbatha. Now it was the day of preparation for the Passover, and it was about the 6th hour, which in this reference, I believe, is referencing about 6 a.m. Roman time, not Jewish time. And he said to the Jews, "Behold your king." So they cried out, "Away with him! Away with him! Crucify him!" Pilate said to them, "Shall I crucify your king?" The chief priests answered, "We have no king but Caesar." So then he handed Jesus over to be crucified, and they took Jesus, and he went out bearing his own cross to the place called the place of a skull, which is in Hebrew called Golgotha. And when they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, coming in from the country, and placed on him the cross to carry behind Jesus. And following him was a large crowd of people and of women who were mourning and lamenting. 2 others who were criminals were being led away with him to be put to death with him. And when they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him and the criminals, one on the right and the other on the left. But Jesus was saying, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." They cast lots, dividing up his garments among themselves, and the people stood by looking on. And even the rulers were sneering at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if this is the Christ of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up to him, offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." Now there was on the inscription above him, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Therefore the soldiers did these things, but standing by the cross of Jesus were his mother and his mother's sister, Mary the wife of Clopas and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother from the cross and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to his mother, "Woman, behold your son." Then he said to the disciple, "Behold your mother." From that hour the disciple took her into his own household. The scriptures say that from the 6th hour which is about noon, until the 9th hour, which is about 3 p.m., there was darkness in the middle of the day. Jesus cried out on the cross on that 9th hour, around 3 p.m., "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani," that is, my God, why have you forsaken me?" The curtain in the temple was torn in two, and after this, Jesus, knowing that all things had been accomplished to fulfill the scripture, said, "I am thirsty." A jar full of sour wine was standing there, so they put a sponge full of sour wine upon a branch of hyssop and brought it to his mouth. And Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. It is finished." Having said this, he breathed his last. He bowed his head and gave up his spirit. Let us reflect on this and think about what Jesus willingly did for each of us as we partake.